Well, hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Lance Garrison. I'm Dean for the College of Professional Psychology at the Chicago School. And this is Perspectives in Professional Psychology, a podcast of the College of Professional Psychology at the Chicago School. And tonight we have the pleasure and privilege of getting to speak with Dr. Anna Belmonte. Dr. Belmonte is the Division Chair for Forensic Psychology at the Chicago School. And so, Dr. Belmonte, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Belmonte, I was wondering if we could start with you just giving us a little history of you and how you came to have an interest in this area.
Sure. Yeah. I'm an alum of the Chicago School. And so I got my clinical forensic PsyD from the Chicago School. So violence risk assessment that we'll talk about more in depth tonight is obviously a subset of forensic psychology. But forensic psychology as a whole, I think I got interested in it when I was fairly young. Psychology for me was always an interest. Even if I didn't quite know what it was as a younger kid, wanting to help people broadly is one of those things that maybe as an adolescent you might get. But I also had an interest in why people offend or get into trouble with the law. I have people who are lawyers in my family, and that TV shows or things like that about the law always kind of interested me also, but I didn't want to go to law school. I knew that much. And so I went to Michigan State University and I declared my major as psychology going in. I knew that for sure. I knew I wanted to go to grad school at some point too, but I also had to take, some classes outside of my major. So I took a criminal justice course my first semester and really loved it. And that was where forensic psychology was probably first like really well defined for me. I had hoped there was some way to kind of meld those two interests, but really having the label of forensic psychology and what it is, that was kind of the first place that I really heard it and got into it. And then yeah, I was lucky enough to I'm from the Chicago area and I wanted to come back to that area for graduate school. Lucky enough to see somebody from the Chicago School at a grad fair, and it was one of the few places out there that had forensic psychology programs. So
Mm.
that kind of set my path from, I don't know, 15 years ago to now.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, there really aren't that many kind of dedicated forensic psychology programs in the country.
No, no, there's very few. Our program is at not only in Chicago, but all of the campuses we have it, particularly our licensure master's program and our PsyD in clinical forensic psychology. Those don't really exist in a lot of places. The ability to like specialize while you're in graduate school, but also be eligible for a licensure in many places is
Yeah.
a really challenging, like dual focus to find in one program. A lot of places make you do 2 degrees potentially, or you get to take 1 or 2 classes in that specialty. So, yeah, I was lucky to find the Chicago school, and now I'm lucky to continue shepherding new people into the Chicago school as well.
Fantastic. Well, let's just get right into the topic of the night. Can
Yeah.
you tell us what is violence risk assessment? And you hinted at this earlier, but it's like a smaller area within forensic psychology. So maybe just describe violence risk assessment and how that fits within the broader field.
Yeah. So violence risk assessment is, without uh, being too fancy with the verbiage, is assessing somebody's potential for violence in the future. It's not, though, a like, oh, I'm going to, run through this list of things and I'm going to determine that this person is 56% likely to offend and commit a murder in the next 30 days. We're not as precise as that and probably will never be because humans are humans. But violence risk assessment is using research about humans and why and how they commit violence, those background patterns, and helping that to inform our interviews with clients, assessment of a client, to ultimately be able to make a suggestion, a directive about a client, what their propensity for violence might be in the near future. And more importantly, what are areas that we might be able to target to reduce that risk for the future? Again, we can't give an actuarial assessment,
Right.
but we can figure out maybe what sort of behaviors or background pieces of someone's life might lead them to reoffend, and then target that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, being folks with doctoral degrees in clinical psychology, I think it's easy for others to assume that, hey, we understand and can predict human behavior. Human behavior is notoriously difficult to predict. And a lot of times what I mean, it's a little bit cliche, but it's cliche because it's true. Some of the best data that we have on the likelihood of someone engaging in a behavior in the future is based on their past behavior and a kind of a deep study of that, right?
100%. And yeah, not to get too far ahead of myself, but that's one of the biggest things that we look for when we're
Yeah.
assessing somebody's violence risk. Future behavior informs, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, past behavior informs future behavior.
Yeah.
And that's hallmark of it all.
Yeah. Now, you talked a little bit earlier about having an interest in um, shows about crime or, and I think they're incredibly popular, obviously. We've
Yeah.
got whole television channels dedicated
Yeah.
to that kind of content. And we hear about things like violence risk assessment. When we hear about that, it's often related to high profile cases.
Yeah.
But the reality is it's happening much more broadly. So I was wondering if you could talk about where violence risk assessment, where the work of that most commonly occurs.
Yeah, definitely. It occurs everywhere, as you kind of said. So first, violence risk assessment, I think to what your point also lends itself to. Most people think when we say violence risk assessment, and most times it is, it's about violence from somebody to somebody else. But there's also risk of self harm. And those types of risk assessments any clinician does in their
Sure.
day-to-day work, even people who don't work in a forensic setting are still and should be still assessing somebody for their risk to hurt somebody else as much as their risk to hurt themselves. But when we get into the very specific violence risk assessment that happens in forensic contexts, it literally happens in every mental health evaluation that goes through the court. I've done lots of competence to stand trial evaluations, always a risk component there. I've done just specific risk assessments for the court. That's all I've done, and is take a background history and provide some insight. Sex offender evaluations, just general evaluations for the court, insanity defense evals, even on the civil side of things, fitness to parent, child custody. Pretty much every assessment that a forensic clinician does incorporates some level of violence risk assessment, whether it's formal or it's just let's make sure as we're doing this evaluation that this person isn't exhibiting any risks.
Yeah, that kind of leads to a follow-up question about that because, yeah, I was thinking about the work I do as a psychologist. And I mean, you're right that there's a component of assessment with every interaction we have with a client, right? We're checking for potential indicators of potential for self-harm or harm to others. But I think the kind of violence risk assessment that you're talking about through the
Mhm.
courts is a much more formal and structured process. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So, as I mentioned, the process of the risk assessment isn't like a calculation of any kind. It's gathering of data and use of pinpoints that we have from research to show what were commonalities from people who had offended in many, many years of research. So, if I was simply to do just a risk assessment or the risk assessment portion potentially of an evaluation, I'd be asking really targeted questions of the individual I'm evaluating about their history of violence, their history of nonviolent offending, and what their home life was like growing up. And most of these things are pertaining specifically to adults. With kids, there's some other nuances, and I can clarify that in a second. But we're looking into substance use, problems in their interpersonal relationships or employment, trauma experiences in their history, looking at mental health history and diagnoses. And all those are historical factors. We also look at some of those same things as dynamic factors as well, which can change at any point in time. So somebody might have a mental health diagnosis or it in their past. One doesn't mean necessarily they're presenting any symptoms right now. or they might be not presenting the same symptoms that they always have. So we're looking at that, whether they're stable in terms of their behavioral stability, affective, emotional stability, and their cognitive stability as well. Do they think of themselves as a bad person inherently, for example? And yeah, we're looking at their response in the past to treatment, or if they've been on like supervision for a criminal offense, let's say, have
Mhm.
they abided by that, or has there not been, that great of a response? Has medication been helpful for their mental health disorder? Have they been
Right.
adherent to that medication, for example?
And I would imagine that some of that risk assessment involves kind of context dependent variables. Like, are there certain
Yeah.
situations that are inherently more potentially triggering for a violent episode?
Yeah, sure. I think when we think about what would quote unquote trigger a person, it's this overwhelm of situation where they're, even if they have coping skills, it overwhelms their ability to cope. So I think one of the things that gets to that question is the idea of relevance related to the variables that I was kind of talking about. So like the historical variables, like I mentioned, those don't change. You either were violent in the past or you weren't, right? But somebody who is maybe we're evaluating them at 56 years old, and the only fight that they ever had was at like 20 years old when they were in college, and nobody really seriously got hurt. And it was like a mutual fight. It wasn't somebody charging another person. Those kind of circumstances and context and like the length of time since then, it doesn't erase the fact that it happened, but the relevance to the place and time and risk for the future of that person offending, that's the context that we need to take into consideration, and that's where our professional judgment as forensic psychologists comes into play.
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking all humans have a potential for violence,
Mhm.
right? This is about measuring the relative risk of violence without tying a specific probability to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
One of the, I think, common narratives for society more generally when it comes to people who commit acts of extreme violence is that they just snap
Yeah.
at some point. From a psychological and research perspective, how accurate is that notion?
Not very. And that's kind of going back to what you were saying about what mass media and television shows portray. I mean, there is a television show called Snapped that's been around for like 20 years, right? So I think where that phenomenon comes from is and how we explain it as psychologists. There's two different kinds of violence that we kind of look at. Snapped, those sort of phenomenons, there's something called reactive or affective violence. And that is when somebody in the moment becomes overwhelmed and they resort to violence in the moment as an emotional response to a stressful situation. Those sort of things tend to be interpersonal violence or bar fight, road rage, those sort of incidents. The mass violent offenses that we see nearly daily, weekly, monthly in our media here in the US, those things we tend to consider those as called predatory violence. That means it's planned, targeted violence. You need a pretty high cognitive ability to
Yeah.
plan those types of offenses. And you need time oftentimes to plan those kind of offenses. And so the snapped phenomenon doesn't really necessarily apply there. Now, that's not to say that the person who goes off and engages in a mass shooting isn't experiencing some mental health or issues that do cause them to certainly make a decision at some point, but it's not I'm going to, 5 minutes from now or immediately after I'm triggered, go and commit a very violent offense like that.
Yeah. I think it touches on another misconception when it comes to drivers of mass violence, and that is that severe mental illness is the primary driver. What does the research actually say about that?
Yeah, it doesn't say that. I think again, these things in the media and just even colloquial phrases that we use, people use the word like psychotic to describe people who are just unpredictable or engage in a behavior that's not the norm in society versus the clinical actual psychosis that, you and I, any psychologist, mental health professional kind of knows. And yeah, the vast majority of individuals do not exhibit psychosis during their or right before an offense of mass violence. There's, let's see, about 70% of shooters, in fact, don't exhibit any signs of psychosis before or during the shooting. They might have a history of mental illness, but that doesn't mean that those actual symptoms drove them to engage in the way that they did.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think that that misconception has created part of what goes into the stigma associated with mental illness. And we get stuck in this place where we call anything psychotic that we don't understand,
Yeah,
right? And
absolutely.
there's a pretty big gap between the clinical expression of psychosis and what people more broadly think is psychotic behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, again, psychotic in our definition are those things like hallucinations and delusions. Yeah, not just erratic behavior. People who are psychotic and have a psychotic disorder might also display erratic behavior, but that in and of itself, or yeah, just, I think a lot of people see somebody who, perpetrated, a mass shooting could never imagine any well human being doing that. They would never be able to see themselves. And so it's kind of automatically like this person must be unstable or mentally ill in
Yeah.
order to have done this.
Yeah. There has to be an explanation, and the explanation is likely
Yeah.
that they have a severe mental illness, but we know that's just not true more often than not. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is the pathway to intended violence model. Why has that become such an important framework for understanding targeted violence?
Yeah, it is tested over time. I think that's why it has become such a forefront. It was developed originally by researchers Calhoun and Weston, and it happened. They first started considering this in the mid 1990s. Maybe first published it maybe in the early 2000s, even up until some research that was done in 2021. Um, so, decades, it still holds up and is a great model to show how somebody answer that exact question. When we see something on the TV and we're like, how did that happen? This is a model that can kind of show how somebody got to the point where they engage in a behavior that, a typical human would never think to potentially engage in.
One of the things we talk a lot about as clinical psychologists and being responsible for training the next generation of psychologists is the importance of the evidence base.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's exactly where the pathways model comes from. It's just deeply grounded in a lot of research.
Yeah, it is. And it also kind of tells us these different places where intervention might be able to help. And it has grounded a lot of other research that's come from
Yeah.
it as well.
So what are some of the early stages of that pathway that you think clinicians or educators or even community members might overlook?
Yeah, so let me briefly kind of share what the steps along the pathway are. And I think it's important to know like even though it's titled a pathway, it doesn't mean somebody is meticulously going step by step by step along this. There are
It's
many
not
people who
linear.
start Yeah, it's not linear. Many people start it, never move to the end, or some people move forward, back up, that kind of thing. But at the crux of it, it starts with somebody who has what we call a grievance. And a grievance, again, it's one of those things that is a specific term we use, but the general public thinks about it a little bit differently. And in this instance, a grievance means that somebody feels like something happened to them and they're being treated very unjustly or it's not fair. A lot of these more like famous or prevalent examples are people who feel like they were terminated from work unjustly or unfairly, or a student who feels like they are not treated well at school by their peers, were given poor grades, or the teachers don't treat them well, or like a loss in their love life also is one of those things that comes up a lot. And so a grievance, though, even though it's the first place the pathway starts, it's really, really difficult for anybody, clinicians, non clinicians, to tell whether that grievance is going to make its way to the end and result in an actual act of violence. And the reason for that obviously is a lot of things can be grievances, and grievances are really, really personal. And so that's not the best place that we see intervention happening the most often. But as we move along in the pathway, we're looking at places where things begin to solidify a little bit more. So the next stage is the ideation stage, and this is where somebody has made the cognitive choice in their mind, whether it's conscious or unconsciously, but they have determined that the only way to absolve themselves of these feelings about their grievance is to be violent, and they become very fixated on that act of violence and can't move past it. And so that's one place where we might be able to start seeing folks have behavioral changes that outwardly kind of tell us, oh, something's maybe a little off. Like if you have somebody who is, ruminating vocally, is speaking a lot about a specific topic, getting very agitated while they're speaking about a topic, that might be a sign that somebody is not able to kind of move past this wrong that happened to them. Again, it's not always, but it could be.
You start to see some of the cognition associated with the
Yes,
grievance turn into behavioral expression.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And yeah, and to that point, that even happens the next couple of steps. First, we see people who start to do the planning and research behind the act. So this is figuring out where it's going to take place, when it's going to take place, how it's going to take place, what they're going to do. They're researching things like even like floor plans or ins and outs of buildings. And in this situation, you might start to see people who are even like canvassing or casing spaces, doing a lot of research about law enforcement or potentially and their response. However, I want to note here that the internet and the proliferation of information about mass violence actually has made this not as overt of a act any longer, because somebody can sit behind their computer and find this information in a lot of instances. But then the next step when they're starting to accumulate materials or prepare is one of those overt behavioral signs. You might see people starting to amass weapons, start to give away items, preparing if they are not intending to live past the event. We've seen mass violent offenders send away their family members, or write manifestos, draft wills, even figuring out like how that person is going to get to the venue, and if they intend to leave the venue, how they're gonna escape that pathway. So those overt behaviors as well. And then finally we get to the last kind of two steps on the pathway, which go hand in hand. Often it's breach and then attack. And the breach, even though they're kind of in quick succession from each other, an attack can still be stopped at the breach
Yeah.
stage. Security, bystanders, even a person who kind of loses their guts, if you will, those sorts of things can happen as well.
There's still an opportunity for intervention at that point.
Yes. It gets small at that point, but
Yeah.
it's still there.
So speaking of intervention, you touched on this a little bit as you were working your way through the different steps of the pathway. Where along that pathway are the opportunities for intervention? You described a couple, and then where's maybe the optimal pathway that we
Yeah.
know, the optimal point in the pathway for intervention?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the optimal point is before somebody's grievance turns into anything, or before the grievance happens. But the grievance sometimes is not preventable. And again, you can't tell when somebody's going to react to a situation that's not in a way that others may as well. And so, yeah, I think in those earlier stages, the ideation stage, the preparation stage, those are probably the ideal places because it's not far along enough where harm could have been done. But really, any place before harm is done is the ideal place to intervene. Different people would intervene in these different instances. Some of these things are law enforcement, responses versus clinician responses.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, about opportunities for intervention. I'm guessing the earlier you are in that pathway, the people that are most likely to see and
Mm.
potentially intervene would be those closest to
Yep.
the person who started moving down that pathway. So that would involve family or
Yeah.
friends, and so what it, what could intervention look like at that
Mhm.
point?
Yeah, it can be it'll vary, honestly, between it depending on where they're at and what they're displaying, but it could be as simple as a loved one seeing a major shift in the person's, personality or everyday behaviors, and their schedule even, and noticing that and talking with the person about that even. If they're not that far along, there might be an ability to have a rational conversation with that person, but it also might be a unfortunate decision to put, a loved one in, but having to contact law enforcement or help contact a hospital or get somebody involuntarily treated for ensuring that they are not going to be a harm to others. But I think there's lots of places too, if somebody is in treatment with a clinician, we might start to see these things regularly. Let's say if somebody is in weekly therapy and we start to see them escalating in their affect, in how much they're speaking about an event. And again, those are decisions as clinicians we can make to help guide somebody to get help in the moment, or if, worse comes to worse, a clinician involuntarily hospitalizing somebody.
Yeah, going back to the idea of members of the family intervening, it's so tough, right?
Mhm.
Because I think family members often don't want to betray the trust or make the other person angry or feel violated in some way.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering if you could talk about that piece of the family intervention, and because when I think about that, or when I've had these conversations with people before, um I always try to frame it as, this is an act of love in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. It's an act of your caring for that person. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that perspective in your experience.
Yeah. First, I think what you were saying about loved ones feeling like they're, betraying. I think also we shouldn't forget that there are loved ones who aren't going to be able to even conceive that their loved
Sure.
one would act this way. And I think we've seen this, in very famous mass violent offense, Columbine being one of them. We've seen documentaries come out after the fact of mom coming out being like how guilty as a parent that she feels, and things like that. And so I think, as much as the violent offense is terrible, family members also have to understand that they're not mind readers. They might be powerless in certain times to figure that out. But if you are starting to see that loved one deteriorate or change their behavior, become aggressive for the first time. They've never been agitated like that before. I think, yeah, it has to be framed as it's helping the person ultimately. And it is. It's a tough place to be in to risk what you might see as a fracture in your relationship with the person. But what is the cost if that doesn't happen? And knowing that as a family member, it's not on you to fix it. Like it's helping get the right services to the person. And even if you're wrong necessarily, you're seeing something clearly in an individual that is showing you that somebody needs help, or something's not right with them in the moment. And so even if it doesn't lead to where you think it's going to lead to, it doesn't mean that the person can't benefit from some aspect of support, that they're not getting at that moment.
Yeah. You touched on some of the warning signs or warning behaviors that could signal escalating risk, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about which ones tend to be the most concerning from a forensic psychologist perspective.
Yeah, I don't know necessarily that there is a specific behavior that is most concerning, but I think what is most concerning is multiple of those behaviors together in a pattern. Like, we're not just talking about someone who, they get fired from their job and are angry and upset for a few days. or even weeks. It's that's a traumatic, stressful, upsetting event. That is a response that we would expect from somebody who was not expecting to be let go of their job, right? But we want to see this behavioral pattern really change. And I think that that's the key, and maybe could help non-clinicians out there even understand that we want to see a sustained pattern of change, not just a reaction. Again, there might be, that's the reactionary violence we're talking about in that I mentioned earlier, and the pathway to intended violence is just that. It's to show how somebody moves along the decision to engage in an intended act of violence or a predatory act of violence. And so, we might see it a little bit differently from somebody who has an effective reaction and engages in violence. But yeah, those behavioral changes that we're seeing sustained, really seeing different, like somebody who's isolating themselves, somebody who's becoming agitated quickly, somebody who is like maybe they've never been really that fascinated with weapons or military or police, and they're starting to get more involved in those niche areas that they never really were excited about previously. Those types of behaviors are really what we're looking for. If somebody overtly also tells you the plan, that's probably the most concerning, of course. But
Yeah.
also one of the most rare things to happen. Leakage happens, it's a little bit different, but somebody communicating overtly, this is my plan on this date and this time, that's not unfortunately usually how it goes.
Yes. Could you talk a little bit more about the idea of leakage and
Yeah.
what does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah, yeah. Leakage is one of those terms too that I think was coined, through the FBI and research into threat assessment, especially after, Columbine and other mass shooting events that happened in the early 2000s. Leakage really is kind of that. It's a information that somebody inadvertently or intendedly leaks about their plans. Again, it's not normally them like calling law enforcement up and saying, "Hey, this is my plan. If you want to stop me, come stop me." This is more, people who are posting on message boards, veiled threats, or maybe it's somebody who is planning to become violent at their workplace or their school, and they let former coworkers or peers say, "Hey, you might not want to come to school on this date. Not sure what's going to happen, but maybe stay home."
Yeah.
So it's still covert. It's not, saying exactly everything, but there's bits and pieces of information. Maybe it's posting a manifesto or parts of it on a website, that's available. I've seen and evaluated kids who have posted something in their like Instagram bio,
Yeah.
for example. And yeah, it's very leakage is even when I say the covert or the overt, somebody saying I am going to do this at this point in time is rare. Leakage happens in almost half of mass violent offenses,
Yeah.
and when the perpetrator is under 21, that number shoots up to 86%. Uh,
Wow.
so it's a very common thing, and that's why I think that term is heard in a lot of places and spaces these days.
Yeah.
It happens so much.
So it's almost like a pre-broadcasting
Yeah.
of the intent.
Yeah, and oftentimes it is one of those things that can be interpreted as like a cry for help or like a
Yeah.
last, stop me if you can sort of thing.
Yeah.
But and sometimes like I think this is why we see it jump in kids is kids sometimes have more trouble, keeping things in.
Yeah.
They're more apt to talk, and so it also just might be an inability to restrain themselves and
Yeah.
keep something secret.
So it's curious because I'm wondering from your experience if you feel like as a society we've gotten better at identifying and acting on leakage because when we look back over the last several decades, early on they do these kind of post hoc evaluations of these big violent events, mass shooting events, and there would be all of these signs of leakage that were there, but no one took them seriously. Are we learning our lesson as a society around this?
I think so. I do
Yeah.
think, as we, learn, I mean, the unfortunate reality is when we have more and more of these instances in this country, you learn from it more and
Yeah.
more, right?
Way to learn, but
Exactly. And so yes, I think there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of research attention on this. There's a whole book, and we use it in our program. It's called the Violence Project. The researchers have been doing a lot of talk shows and press and public safety kind of talks about the research they have. But here's the tricky part: is the general public never hears when leakage was used to stop an offense, right? We're not going to get a big notification. Oh, look, this violent offense was stopped. There are times we
Yeah.
get those notifications sometimes saying like FBI or counterterrorism stopped this terrorist cell from happening. Those are those we typically hear, but those instances of domestic terrorism or school shootings, workplace violence, we don't tend to hear about those. So it's kind of impossible to know how well we're learning, especially as the instances of mass violence continue to climb in this country.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a an idea that when the media does this like deep coverage of these mass shooting events or violent events, that it could help trigger violent events in other people. And I know that that's a commonly shared concern. But to your point, we don't talk about all of the ways that intervening as a family member or a community member or a friend can help avert these. And I think that that could have a similar effect, right? It could make people feel more empowered and encouraged to intervene early when they see some of these signs of leakage.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, yeah, unfortunately, sometimes we have to the response to prevention of these mass events are law enforcement responses oftentimes, or intelligence even responses for terrorism, domestic terrorism. And those investigations are inherently secretive, right? But yeah, that the everyday sort of brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, teachers, even principals, bosses at work, HR professionals, all those things. There, yeah, it's unknowing how many people have impacted, the prevention.
Do you think that, I mentioned this when I was speaking a little bit earlier, but do you think that broad media coverage of these mass violent events makes prevention more difficult?
Yes and no. Um, I so I think when we talk about media coverage, it has cultivated, unfortunately, another reason for people to commit these offenses. And it's not as prevalent. I think the research, if I remember correctly, says that about 7% of people who perpetrate mass shootings are notoriety is one of the reasons that they do that. And so that certainly contributes to it. But to your question also about prevention, the other thing that comes to mind for me is because, and going back to the pathway that I discussed, the media response, the police emergency response, how schools now respond to instances of violence, the prevention of it and the intervention of violence, especially at that like breach stage potentially, has been, I think, made more challenging by mass media, but also just the internet in general. There's so much out there on the internet. There's easily accessible, not even just how much is out there, but anybody who has a phone now, kids and especially social media, TikTok, it's easier than ever to find bad information. I actually, this is
Yeah.
just very timely. I just saw a post on Instagram before hopping on here that AI chatbots. They're all but I think 2 of them, if I recall correctly, um, actually helped somebody figure out how to, be violent and what to accumulate, talk to them through weapons, and, like, some of the highest ones were, like, 98 to 100% of the time when these were tested. AI was walking people through the steps for this. Uh,
That's incredibly disturbing. I
yeah.
know there have been some high profile cases where AI chatbots have helped people plan suicides.
Yep,
And so what I'm hearing from you is it'll help you plan a violent event as
yep,
well, which is very
terrifying.
sad and really terrifying. Well, if it's okay, Dr. Belmonte, I want to shift the focus just for a minute to talk about students who might be interested in forensic psychology as a field.
Absolutely.
What skills or training do you think are most important for someone who wants to work in forensic psychology or more specifically in violence risk assessment?
Yeah, I think again, like I said, they're kind of one and the same because pretty
Yeah.
much anything you're going to do in forensic
It's
psychology,
part of being a forensic
yeah,
psychologist.
exactly, or forensic clinician for those
Yeah.
who are maybe interested more in a master's degree. Um, I think we just talked about a lot of heavy information, right? And I think that the ability to tolerate that heaviness in whatever way, shape, or form that works for
Yeah.
you is imperative for students coming into this field. And they don't have to have those skills independently. Those are things that people learn and develop over time in graduate school and post grad supervision, even throughout their careers. And it's more about like recognizing internally if something is activating you. It's not that you have to push your feelings, emotions away completely. It's being cognizant of them and then knowing what to do with them. And so I something like for me, I get asked this question all the time, like, how can you do this? And how can people like you just hear all these things and research and whatnot. And I think that that is what also is unique about our programs and the students that are drawn to it is there's an inherent interest in forensic psychology, in understanding why people act the way they do and what brings them to the table the day that you're meeting with them. And that interest, at least for me, will buoy you, through those tough parts. I think, again, as you've kind of heard, there's writing and documentation and critical thinking skills that again a lot of clinicians need, but in forensic psychology is even especially important. A lot of times when I'm writing these risk assessments as part of forensic evaluations, I'm not going and explaining my findings to the judge, to the jury, even to the attorney or evaluee themselves. I just hand over a report with my findings, and I hope that it conveys what I'm hoping it conveys. So being able to write well, organize your writing well is really important. But again, is a skill that you learn through graduate school. But still, having some of those basic skills and the ability to receive feedback on them and the desire to grow those skills, I think are really important.
Yeah, there are a whole bunch of skills and competencies associated with becoming a forensic psychologist or a forensic counselor or a clinical psychologist, any of the licensed mental health professions that you learn over the course of going through a graduate program. You spoke about one that I think is probably one of the most critical and is something that the faculty are there to help you develop, but it's important to develop a really keen sense of self awareness,
Yes.
right? Like you said, it's not about not feeling, it's not about boxing it up and setting it to the side. It's about knowing what you're feeling when you're feeling it and then kind of having a good set of self-care skills and consultation skills in your toolbox as you kind of develop and grow and engage in the process of becoming a forensic psychologist.
Yeah, I had a former supervisee shock me by saying something like, "How can you be so unemotional about things?" And I'm like, "Unemotional? I'm a very emotional person, but when you're in, these settings, you have to be aware of your emotionality and kind of temper that." And yeah, maybe it's separately or after. But it just yeah, those are those skills that you've gotta develop, and it does. It ends up, protecting you and making you be able to do better work. And that's the ultimate goal.
So what I hear you saying, Dr. Belmonte, is psychologists have feelings too.
They do, they do. That whole blank slate phenomenon is
Yeah.
no longer a thing. We are real people who also influence the events that happen when we're interviewing or doing therapy.
Yeah. Might look like a blank slate, but there's a
Right.
lot going on in there.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Is there one thing you wish the public understood better about the process of violence prevention and risk assessment?
Gosh, just one.
Yeah,
I
just one.
I mean, yeah, I think the broad thing is just don't believe everything you see on
Yeah.
TV or in the media or even on your phone in your hand, about people who offend, about violence, about, just yeah, anything. Misinformation is so much is out there everywhere. But I think to about violence specifically, and I've said this in other places, but people who have a mental illness are actually more likely to be victims versus perpetrators of violence. So the individuals who are severely mentally ill are individuals who are vulnerable and at risk. They vacillate in states of not being aware of what's happening in their surroundings, which makes them very much at risk from being taken advantage of or harmed. And so, yeah, and so I think that the stigma around mental health. A lot has gone, since especially COVID. A lot has been done to destigmatize mental health in general, but severe mental illness, I think, it still has this equatance to bad behavior.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I would love for the general public to kind of realize that and not jump to the conclusion of, oh, he must have been psychotic. And I say he because most mass violence individuals are he.
Yeah.
Um, but that person must have,
Statistically, that's absolutely
yeah,
true.
yeah, they must be psychotic and they must be yada yada, all of these words. And yeah, that's what I would hope.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Belmonte, thank you so much.
Thank
If it's
you.
okay with you, we'll open it up for a few questions. I think I saw at least one go into
Yeah,
the chat earlier.
absolutely.
How does this is from Francisco? How does an unsupportive, toxic environment play into the events, and how does the approach to assist with motivating the individual change the course and provide them with the assistance they need?
Sure. So I think the piece of the question that is the most relevant is the toxic environment element, and I think that's one thing I kind of breezed through at the beginning is the experience of trauma being a risk factor, and when we're talking about adults, it's kind of a singular ish risk factor experience or trauma. Did it happen? Did it not? How relevant? Whatever. But when we're talking about youth, that those traumatic experiences, we look a lot more dimensional at what's going on there. I mean, that toxic environment that you might be seeing. So things like with youth, especially, are what are their parents? Are they managing the kids in the home? Does the kid have guidance at home? Do they have rules? If they have rules, are the parents actually enforcing those rules? We also look at instability of caregivers. So, yeah, a kid who might have had a parent in and out of the house because of substance use, that might indicate a little bit more of a risk factor. And so, even though those are historical risk factors, some of them might be still changeable potentially, especially when we're talking about youth. And I think just to step aside from intentional or intended rather violence, situations where interpersonal relationships are toxic or not healthy, those are certainly risk factors for effective or reactionary violence.
Another question from Alejandra. What type of trainings would you recommend for clinicians to support clients with an underlying past history of violence and substance use disorders?
Yeah, there's a lot out there, and I guess it depends on what kind of intervention or evaluation type work, what the background is of the clinician. But I would say to start making sure that you have some really good skills in just the assessment of violence risk, both of self to harm and harm to others. One of the things I've heard recently in some of my work outside of the school is that even clinicians who are very well trained, social workers, licensed professional counselors, psychologists themselves, they might be very comfortable evaluating somebody for a risk of harm to themselves, but would be
Yeah.
completely uncomfortable and have no idea what to do if their client came to them and said, I want to kill XYZ. And so I think that very basic training would be essential to all of our first level responders, our psychologists, clinicians, social workers. Obviously, at some point, it might get punted to a forensic psychologist, but it's needed on the day to day basis for all clinicians. Um, so that would be one. Making sure you're maybe some like trauma informed intervention work would be important as well. But if you're looking for more higher level skills, if you're already a clinician or are looking to get into more evaluation side of things, there are trainings specifically for some evaluation tools. The HCR 20 version 3 is what is kind of like the gold standard, if you will, to use for violence risk assessment for adults. And then the SAVRI, structured assessment for violence risk in youth, is what is typically used for young. Both are what we call structured professional judgment tools, which means that you have to have the knowledge and clinical knowledge to fill it out, weigh the information after doing a file review, a clinical interview, collateral interviews, all that sort of stuff. And so you really need some really good training in use of those tools before you start working in that field.
And I'm going to go out on a limb and say we do that. We do a lot of that work in our programs as well, helping prepare students to
Yes.
use their clinical judgments and
Yeah.
applying
Yeah.
the tools.
Yeah. We have a violence risk assessment class in our master's and a doctorate program, and they go over those tools, especially, and just overall in general, violence risk assessment.
We have another question from Joseph. What do you think the role of parents play in school shootings? Should the parents be held responsible if the child obtains a weapon elsewhere than the home? So outside of the home.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing that, very recently, and local to me here in the Chicago area with the Highland Park mass shooting event. We are seeing parents who, help their children get weapons or allow them to use weapons from the home. We're seeing them get criminal charges. And yeah, I don't know that that's anything any forensic psychologist maybe would have predicted was going to start happening, but it's not. That might be, what happens. As far as how they play a role in school shootings, period, like I go back to what one of the moms of the Columbine shooters says, and just this lack of complete awareness, or even it being unfathomable to consider that your child could act that way. And I think inherently, I'm not a parent myself, but I would think any parent would have a very hard time seeing their kid in the light of, oh, I could see them going out and killing a lot of people. And so I want to give grace in those situations. However, at the same time, there are certainly instances where parents' lack of oversight and parental management has led to mass shootings or just violence in general. And I've seen parents who are like, I never set foot in my kid's room. I have no idea what's in there. Or a parent who has no idea who their kids' friends are, who has no idea how they spend their time outside of the home, isn't keeping up with their ability or their achievement in school. And those sorts of things, again, there's a lot of reasons why parents aren't involved. The parent might have, mental health problems themselves. They might be overwhelmed, or a single parent have to work many jobs. And so I have grace for that as well. But those are situations where we see that, that leakage or those preparation efforts or those sort of things go unmissed by those closest around them because of that lack of involvement.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to kind of flip it a little bit, just from a prevention perspective, what I hear you say for Belmonte is that having a parent engaged with their kids, knowing their kids' friends, spending time with their kids to make sure that there aren't any changes going on that
Yeah.
they don't notice. It's really about an investment of time and knowledge and engagement with your kid. And that can go a long way, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I will say it doesn't have to be a parent also. One of the things that is unique about evaluating a kid's a violence risk assessment in the tool that we use is there are specific carve outs for like assessing for protective factors. We kind of do it too in the HCR as well, but it's a little bit different. And so one of the things that we look for in kids is, do they have bonds with adults around them? Do they have at least one pro-social adult around them? Are they engaged in extracurricular kind of activities? And so, again, even if there is a parent who is overburdened, has many children that they need to care for, has to work a lot, it can be mediated by other important adults in that student
Sure.
kid's life.
Yeah. Doesn't have to be a parent. Could be any important adult, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Dr. Belmonte, I know we're a little bit over time. Would you be okay with one more question?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Andrea has a question. Would you recommend that clinicians working with law enforcement support how they assess, as some offenders may have engaged with police in the past before a mass event?
Sorry, I'm just rereading the question, make
Yeah.
sure I understand it.
And Andrea, feel free to pop on and clarify.
I think, and yeah, maybe I'm not going to answer the question the way that it's hoping, but I think there is this delicate balance that I think a lot of folks, clinicians, might have in terms of, do we involve law enforcement in what can be considered a mental health issue, or do we try to not involve them. And I think we want to per- we want to empower clients to and our anybody who we're working with to make decisions for themselves, to not get involved in that system. But I think that at the end of the day, it may be necessary in certain
Right.
instances to get law enforcement involved. And to maybe what the second part of this question is asking, as far as offenders who may have been engaged with police in the past, that is something that, we want to look at. It's a risk factor, certainly, to have past offenses, both violent and nonviolent offenses. And so being in tune with that is important. That's what I'll say.
Fantastic. Maybe just really quickly touch on, because I come from the same place that you do, with in terms of, if we don't have to get law enforcement involved, we don't want to do that, right? Because we want to keep that a safe, confidential, supportive space for positive change. But there is an ethical component to it at some point, right? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I wanna be careful about, like, not I'm not so I think there's a difference between confidentiality and then, like, involving law enforcement. If you suspect a client is a harm to themselves or others, if they tell you that directly, there's a inherent duty for us to break any sort of confidentiality. First off, in forensic settings there is no confidentiality, so that's a little bit
Right.
separate and apart. But there's a difference between breaking that confidentiality and calling 911, or breaking that confidentiality, calling a person's parent or husband, wife, significant other, partner, and saying, "Hey, I think we need to work together to get this person hospitalized and managed before they can come home," and taking that step first. But if there is a overt threat to the general public, to an individual, those sort of things should get law enforcement involved. Many states have what we call duty to warn, the Tarasoff case out of, I think it's California. And so there are ethical and legal obligations that a clinician has if those things arise. And yes, at that point in time, law enforcement might need to be involved, especially if like a Tarasoff warning needs to be enacted to somebody that the clinician has, no idea who that person is or how to contact that person.
Well, Dr. Belmonte, this has been a lot of fun, very informative. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This was great.
And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We appreciate you being here, and hope you found it informative and interesting and engaging. We'll see you next month on Perspectives in Professional Psychology.
Thank you.